This is Eddie Wilson welcoming you to Austin Roots, a podcast about how Austin, Texas became flavored the way it is.
And this is Dr. Jason Mellard, a cultural historian, doing my best to connect the old and the new in this city we call home.
Or the center of the musical universe.
Richard Zelade is a collector and teller of Texas tales, originally from East Texas. He attended UT Austin in the 1970s and became a professional writer upon graduation, publishing in Texas Monthly, Texas Parks and Wildlife, People, Southern Living, and other forums. He's written Central Texas guidebooks and a trilogy of Austin histories, Guytown by Gaslight, Austin Murder and Mayhem, and our primary focus today, Austin in the Jazz Age. I personally don't know anyone who's read as widely or deeply in the primary sources of Austin history. And he's always the first name that I tell people when they ask about early Austin history research. So welcome, Richard. How are you today?
Just fine, thank you. It's a beautiful day.
It is. It is a good day out. One of the things about this trilogy of books in the History Press that you have, and you've got a couple more coming up from what I understand, is that the Austin history most people carry around in their heads, and especially since, we're a city of waves and waves of newcomers, so memory isn't long. Most people have this sense of Austin history that doesn't really go back much further than the 1960s or maybe World War II, the span of living memory, really. And you've done such a great work in your writing of fleshing out everything that came before, from the founding years in the 19th century through the Jazz Age Renaissance. How did you first get interested in Austin's longer past, and why do you think it's interesting to have that fuller sense or that longer view?
Well, I've been a historian ever since I can remember. Started writing, winning prizes at school when I was 13. But as far as Austin goes, it started when I came up here and amplified my previous bike riding experiences. So I'd go out on my training rides, because I was racing at the time, and ride through the countryside and see things and wonder, I wonder what that is. I wonder where that came from. And then I'd come home, and this being pre-internet days, I'd have to dig through books until I found out what I wanted to find out, and that's where the Handbook of Texas, the Encyclopedia of Texas, basically came in handy. I spent, $150 or $50? It was a huge amount of money at the time. I wanted to make a living out of it. And so I just sort of slipped into writing without really thinking about it.
Yeah, so the Handbook of Texas, at the time, that was a multi-volume affair, right? And now it's all available online.
Yes, it was originally 2 volumes, and Texas just proved to be so big and interesting that they added a 3rd volume, a supplement. And yes, now it's all on line, and my collection basically are, boat anchors that still have some collectible value, I guess, at least if you go to half-price books.
Now, in terms of this longer history, and one of the themes of the podcast and the history that we look at is the music scene. And I think that the music history of Austin is one of those where the 60s, 70s narrative is the most myopic, because, of course, there's always been music here, like any city. And that's one of the things that I really like about the Austin and the Jazz Age book. It's that we name after like one of these turning points in American music history. Can you tell us a little bit about how and when jazz came to grip the city of Austin, what that sort of scene looked like, the role the university played?
I've read every newspaper that's still in existence from the very founding of Austin in 1839 through about 1895, and then again from about 1912 through the mid-1930s. So one of the things that I did was look for the word jazz in Austin newspapers. And the first mention of jazz was, I believe, in February of 1917. A jazz record was advertised as being available in a little sort of music column / ad that appeared in the Statesman every so often. And it only took a couple of months for jazz to catch on. It caught on like so many other things in Austin at the University of Texas, because the city of Austin was a very, very conservative town back then, and the University of Texas was the liberal and hedonistic bastion, you could say, or headquarter for that thing in Austin.
Yeah, I remember when I was first starting to research the Austin music of the 60s and the 70s and talking to Eddie a lot, and he pointed me towards you. And the first time I met you and I asked you questions about Austin music in the 60s and 70s, and you immediately went back and said, like, no, you have to understand the 1920s. Like, that's where you start. And that was a real lesson for me. And that's what I've always appreciated about Eddie's, Austin history mind too, is always pushing it back further than that surface level of the stories that most people know. Eddie, when you were coming up in the 1950s, was this earlier jazz history something that you knew about or was on your mind at all? Did you have any sense that there was this earlier chapter?
No. As a young teenager, I was aware that John Philip Sousa had played there, but as a teenager growing up, mostly influenced by the emergence of radio.
I mean, that's what the jazz fans in the 1920s were doing and saying, right? They were about the contemporary and the now, and that jazz was this expression of modernity and rebellion in a way that we can't always hear in the music now. And in terms of those 1800s figures as well, I think for people who don't know a lot about Austin history, one of the other nationally significant figures that everyone should be keyed into is the legend and lore of Ben Thompson.
Oh, Lord, Ben Thompson. He was probably the most colorful and significant character that Austin has ever produced. The contradictory nature of his character. He was a gunslinger, but he was a very cultured man. He was a family man. He was a gambler. And he was finally elected city marshal of Austin in 1880. He had torn up Austin so much in the 1870s, running all the gambling interests, shooting up all of his competitors, and Austin was undergoing a crime wave at the time, and they finally decided, well, if you can't beat them, join them, so to speak. So they figured that the only person who could combat and conquer this lawless wave was the guy who had been previously causing it. So he was elected city marshal and served until 1883, when he went down to San Antonio to settle a score with a gambling competitor, shot and killed him. Amazingly, went to jail, and his attorney, Buck Walton, Eddie could tell you a lot about Buck Walton. Buck Walton couldn't even save him, so he rotted in the San Antonio jail for several months, resigned finally as marshal, although the city begged him not to, even though he was in jail for killing this guy. So they let him out finally. He beat the rap thanks to Buck Walton, came back, shot up Austin for a couple of more months, then went back to San Antonio to settle a score with his nemesis's still living partner, and didn't get so lucky that time. He got shot. But he had lots of toys. He loved toys, and he had a yacht for a while, and he loved to sail up and down what is now Lake Austin with his friends. He thought it was a marvelous way to pass the time. Paddle boats he was into. He was a real techno freak as well. Really enjoyed life. But he could kill and was ruthless at the same time, but loved and adored his family.
So not really an outlaw who became reformed and a lawman, but just an outlaw lawman, like all at the same time, really, in some ways.
Yes, because there was a fine line between outlaw and lawman that existed, and there were plenty in Texas alone, plenty of outlaws who, men who alternated between being good guys and bad guys. And they would come to Austin lauded for their law keeping abilities, and they'd get drunk and shoot something or someone up and get thrown in jail and get kicked out of town.
Now, in terms of getting back to jazz and the jazz age, one of the interesting things that was a real revelation for me in your research, Richard, was sort of how early that music came, that, it's here in 1917 that we know of. But I mean, the first records were really just like the year before. Of course, the New Orleans scene had been blowing up from the grassroots for a decade or more. So it's interesting that it comes to Austin so early. It's also interesting that most of the bands that we know well from that period, because they're covered well in the print sources, are young white bands, but there's always a sense too that this is a black music and one of those kind of crossover musics that we see like at the root of all of American music. So can you tell us a little bit about some of those early bands that we know of and speculate a little bit about the bands that we might not know of? I mean, one of the things I'm really like in the book is the names of some of these acts. It's a fun kind of catalog.
As I say, the first jazz record that came out, I believe, was in 1917, and it was by a group of white musicians. It popped up in Austin, as I said, in the spring of 1917, and jazz came and blossomed so quickly that by the fall of 1917, the Cactus Yearbook staff announced that it was going to feature a new department called Jazz Parties, with photos featuring athletic rallies, pep gatherings, college yells and songs, and yell leader antics. The Austin American on November 11th, 1917, in its weekly UT page, ran Orlando the Rabid Jazzer, which was a lengthy poem that was trying to convince readers not to succumb to the jazz bug. The first jazz band proper in Austin was called Shakey's Orchestra, and it was organized by a young man named Jackie Tobin, who could not read music, but he played piano and was the son of one of the members of Austin's most prominent families, the Tobin family. The Tobins ran a drugstore back in the Guytown days and sold lots of morphine, which you could easily overdose on. They had a bookstore after that, just like in Austin when the Skunks first appeared on the punk scene. You had a wave of followers that joined the fun, and so you had a group called Jimmy's Joys, the Soul Killers, the Firehouse Five, and those were just a few of the bands that sprung up in the first few months of the burgeoning jazz scene. And Jackie got into so much trouble his freshman year at UT that his parents had to transfer him to the University of Virginia. And that's how Shakey's Orchestra, well, it didn't break up. It sort of transferred to the University of Virginia. When Jackie's exile ended a year later, he came back to Austin. But when they got back to Austin, they found that other bands had taken their place. And so Jackie gave up on music and went into the heavy party scene and had a party playhouse downtown that was infamous for all of the sexual and drinking antics that went on there.
And then Jimmy Joy's of those groups might have been the biggest breakout group in some ways of Austin and had a foot in a couple of other scenes, right? Can you tell us a little bit about Jimmy's Joys and where they came from?
Jimmy Maloney was a student at UT. I mean, all of these groups, Steve Gardner was sort of kind of like the Doug Somm of his time, maybe. He was real into getting new bands started up. Anyway, Jimmy Maloney started Jimmy's Joys, which was previously known as the Soul Killers. They started out playing at UT, but they also spent the summers down in Galveston, playing it practically every night at some of the big dance halls in Galveston, because Galveston was where everyone went to in the summer to cool down from the sweltering heat before air conditioning. One of the things that drove Jimmy's Joys into national status was radio. And radio in Austin is its whole separate subject. And people think of KUT now, but modern KUT didn't start until 1960. But back in the 20s, you had KUT, which the call letter stood for come, as in KUM, come to the University of Texas. And it was it was like a 50,000 watt power station, I believe. So you could hear the signal all the way to Nova Scotia sometimes. They featured a lot of live music then. So featuring live music on radio is certainly nothing new. KUT did it on a daily basis. And so Jimmy's Joys would play at least once a week on KUT, and people all over the country would hear it. And they wrote in and said, hey, we love Jimmy's Joys, play us some more. So you cannot underestimate the importance of KUT in particular, making bands, especially Jimmy's Joys, known.
A really important example of roots to the Austin live music scene is to go back to that period where we didn't really have all that many records on the shelf. And you have a station that can play music all day and all night, but you don't have enough records to do that day in and day out. So you have to have live music.
And they proved to be so popular at UT that in 1924 they decided to go national. They all left school and went as a touring band basically on the vaudeville circuit. From there, they went on. Maloney kept his own career going through a succession of groups into the 1940s at least. But he was no longer a jazz musician by then. It was big band.
And did I see that there's some trivia in the book about a prominent big band leader who tried out for Jimmy's Joys at one point?
Yes, that's true. He was a trombone player.
I was reading Glenn Miller.
That's it. Yeah, yes. He came down to audition for Jimmy's Joys from Colorado, drove a flivver down from Colorado, didn't make the cut because he could only read music. He couldn't improvise. And Jimmy's Joys was a strictly improvisational band. I mean, they played wild music. You got to remember that the early days of jazz, very dada. They would jump on top of pianos and play like Jerry Lee Lewis and bang on cast iron skillets. And jazz was more than music. It was a lifestyle, and it was in response to the bloody slaughter of World War II and the influenza epidemic. It was like, live and have fun now because you may be dead tomorrow. So that's why you had the beginnings of wild sexual behavior and gender bending and loose dress and the unbridled nature of early jazz music.
And that comes out in the book, the sort of the effects of World War I and returning soldiers being on the University of Texas campus. The Spanish flu epidemic stuff too, which I I realized the first few times I read this book seemed a lot more historical than it does now. I read that chapter with new eyes in the midst of 2020. A sense of mortality that animates the kind of frantic bohemian behavior of the 1920s.
Yes, because back in those days, the Spanish influenza hit young people particularly hard. You could literally die in a couple of days. At UT, it was so fast. The UT, the campus student doctor said, "Oh, there's nothing to worry about. There's nothing to worry about." And less than a week later, the infirmary was filled with dozens and dozens and dozens of ill students. And all of the soldiers out at Camp Mabry got sick. I mean, they had them housed in tents. It was that bad. And we're talking about November, and they're sick to death, and they're having to live to recuperate, die outdoors. It was pretty heavy duty, and the parallels between that outbreak, pandemic, and what we're experiencing now, you can't help but look at the similarities, except that now, of course, the primary danger is with older folks like Eddie and myself.
In terms of the sort of frantic and bohemian spirit of the age, of jazz being a lifestyle as much as a music, I wanted to spend some time talking about the humor publication, The Ranger, which is such a character in its own right, providing a lot of the illustrations for the Austin and the Jazz Age book. It also gives us an opportunity, like among the early cartoonists, as someone from the Steiner family. And I wanted to ask Eddie, because I've heard a lot about the history of the Steiner family from Eddie over the years. A very important name, and much more than the Steiner Ranch development. Eddie, can you tell us a little bit about who the Steiners were?
Buck Steiner's brother was the editor, I think, one of the major student publications on the campus. He was a cartoonist. Drew some really racy cartoons. There wasn't any rodeo about it. They cut a swath far and wide. The Steiner guys did.
Well, Buck Steiner and Eddie's recollections about Buck Steiner were sort of one of my primary inspirations for the Guy Town by Gaslight book, because Eddie was fond of telling me, because he knew Buck. I never did.
And their family's sort of fame and fortune, capital saddlery, so they were sort of in the rodeo world is where they came up and out of. I feel like I've heard rumors over the years of ties to Chicago where they would ship stuff up, like leather goods to Capone, who probably didn't really need leather goods, but it was, liquor coming out of Texas. And then, so Buck's brother, the cartoonist, is how we got into this. So I wanted to talk about the Ranger a little bit. Can y'all tell our listeners a little about what the Ranger was and its place in Austin culture in the 1920s and well beyond?
College humor magazines were popular throughout the country. Pretty much every university or college of any size had its own college humor magazine. From the 20s on up into the 60s, the modern Ranger, shall we say, that featured Gilbert Shelton and all, they all exchanged magazines, with each other. We had a mutual subscription list system, so everybody was reading everybody else's material. This was no different in the 1920s. And the deal with humor magazines at UT was that the Ranger was the third in a series of college humor magazines that started about 1912 with the Coyote, which was banned in a few years because of its risque humor, cartoons, and basically anti-establishment, let's have fun pose. It was followed by the Scalper in 1919, which ran for several controversial years, and then it was banned. And then the Ranger began in 1923, debuted in October of 23, and immediately attained a circulation of 4,500. The next year, Joe Ernest took over as editor and announced that under the leadership of Joe Steiner, editor-in-chief, and Tom Holloway, managing editor, the negligent and irregular writers and artists of the campus please themselves and attempt to please their readers by their transgressions of propriety, subtlety, and all standards of taste. The editors and staff members of our college comic are connoisseurs of the inane. Their heads are crammed with jokes on liquor, love, and other froth of college life. Its airs are those of the dance, the fireside, the football game, and the petting party, which brings us, the petting parties brings us to the subject of the sexual revolution that was part and parcel of the jazz life, which included gender bending, petting, which was basically defined as every form of sexual movement or practice short of actual intercourse.
And there were still pretty traditional values around marriage and sex, right? So it was all about these kind of like strange gray areas and borderlines.
Well, the way the students got around it was through temporary marriages. If you met and you had the hots for each other and petting simply wasn't enough, you would get married and stayed married for as long as your relationship was interesting. When the ardor had cooled, you just got a divorce. And it was that way to the point that one judge complained about it and said he was sick and tired. All the divorces that he was having to preside over, it was cutting into his regular judicial work, and he asked for legislation to curb these marriages of convenience. That's how they got around it, and the modern prophylactic appeared on the scene in the early to mid-20s, sort of like the pill. Now I've got the pill. Well, now I've got the rubber was one of the keys to liberation in the 20s. That and the removable back seat from the car you were driving.
Yeah, so it gives some context how important the Ranger was. And I think for people, too, when you're talking about college humor magazines, those have kind of disappeared from history, but I think like the common one that people might know is sort of National Lampoons, because the way that they branded later, so it gives you a sense of kind of like what, like the Ranger was in that league for many years. And a lot of influential people, so, not only Buck Steiner's brother, but, Bob Eckhart, the future congressman, spent some time as a cartoonist and writer with the Ranger. And then, as, Richard said, the later generation of people like Gilbert Shelton, the Ranger had this kind of like 60s moment, too, that added a lot to the Austin counterculture. Just as Austin was on the cutting edge of jazz and in jazz really early on, it might even have a stronger calling card in the contributions that Austin made to Western music in both the teens and the 20s, including very important parts of the careers of folks like John Lomax and Tex Ritter. I wonder if we might talk about them in relationship to the Austin story.
I love John Lomax stories and Tex Ritter and Oscar Fox. Oscar Fox is one of the great unsung heroes of country music. Well, what happened was John Lomax began collecting cowboy songs when he was a kid. And when he first went to college back east, I forget which one it was, he presented very proudly his collection of cowboy songs to the faculty, and they promptly pronounced them trash and told him to go burn them because they were worthless. But he finally found a couple of patron professors who encouraged him and helped him to get grants, so that by 1912 he was going around the country collecting both old cowboy songs and black songs from the field workers, from the prison. He came back to UT, not as a professor, but as registrar. And then in, I think it was 1919, 1920, the men's chorus here took a Western turn when Oscar J. Fox became director of the chorus. And he turned the direction of the chorus towards Western music. So you had, their programs consisted mostly of old Western songs that Lomax had collected. And it was a couple of years later that when Ritter came to UT, he tried out for the men's chorus. And a couple of years later, finally, by about 1923, he was basically top dog. The features of each performance were the four lead singers gathered around a fake campfire, dressed in Western outfits, singing Western songs. And Ritter spent the rest of his college career singing with the men's chorus. They did tours every year. So they would go to Brownsville. They had a different itinerary every year. So they were bringing this music and this program to cities across the country, to auditoriums that were so full that they had to turn people away. They would perform on KUT. They did summer live concerts.
So much of the middle decades of the 20th century, the singing cowboy and Western music is really the lifeblood of a lot of American culture at that time. And so Oscar Fox and John Lomax were both mentors to Tex Ritter, J. Frank Dobie as well.
We can't leave Dobie out because they would go to the East Side. When Carl Sandberg came down here, Carl Sandberg was a very popular performer here at UT, and they would all go to hear music. Sandberg said that one of the highlights of his life was going to this one particular club and hearing the black performers do their act.
And I think on one of those visits, one of the first variants of C.C. Ritter was heard by that group of people in one of those East Austin clubs. That Carl Sandberg and John Lomax both documented that.
Tex went on to have his own successful movie career, and we had several UT students from the jazz age who went on to Hollywood to have their own movie careers, set designing careers. One of them went on to be Judy Garland, voice coach for her movie The Wizard of Oz. Buzz Eden's, he was her voice coach, and in her autobiography, she talks about how important Buzz was in her life, and he performed at UT. Ralph Jester, who was the cousin of Governor Jester, went on to become a prominent set designer for those number of Hollywood epics. Smith Ballou, he was a singing cowboy as well.
You've mentioned a few times how in this decade that there was a real pushing back against gender conventions that's expressed in all kinds of ways. Like the flapper itself, we don't often think about it this way, but the flapper itself as an icon was gender bending in some ways and seizing on behaviors and styles that have been considered masculine prior to that. But in terms of people who go on to become stars too, another one that caught my eye in the book, does he go by the name Barbette?
Yeah. But he was from Round Rock, did a circus act, trapeze, and was dressed up as a woman. And then at the very end of his act, he shed his feminine apparel and revealed himself to be, in fact, a man. He really wasn't from Austin, but, Round Rock is pretty much contiguous with Austin now, so I don't have any problems in claiming him as one of our own.
Yeah, and I think Austin would put him in the Hall of Fame maybe before Round Rock would as well. He became kind of the toast of France.
Barbette, yes. And the Summer Texas ran photos in July of 30 of the world's champion she-man. People in Berlin. Now, you got to remember that in 1930 we were at the height of Weimar Republic with all its debauched behavior. So yeah, he was quite popular in Paris and in debauched Berlin.
It's so interesting about that time because it does feel very modern. We often have a sense that this kind of like pushing back against the masculine feminine binary is something of the 21st century, but there is this long history, and then that history keeps being erased over and over again. These are narrative through lines. These things have been with us always. I was remembering another Buck Steiner story. Eddie, do you remember, is it true, is there something about Buck Steiner and Gene Autry and Cuba? Does that ring any bells?
And the story was that Buck and the rodeo production crew was in Cuba, but Gene Autry being the big star when Fidel Castro took over. There was a lot of letter writing going on with Lyndon Johnson before it all got cleared up. And they got out of Cuba and got back with everything intact except Gene Autry's 2 6-guns.
I was trying to remember today, before we came here, how Moton Crockett's timeline fit into all of this. Both his Muzak stuff and then Big Bertha, too. Would these have been in this same period or later?
Moton Crockett, who was our landlord downtown for 20 years, started the first pre-recorded music in the elevators, but later LBJ Media Corporation swooped into town and Mr. Crockett got out from under his elevator music. 1955 was always been easy to remember when it came to Moton's contribution to the Big Bertha UT. He drove that drum, I believe, from Chicago to Austin in a blizzard with a trailer on the back of his car. Got a kick out of it every football season thereafter.
And Moton Crockett, too, there is a distant relation to Davy.
Moton been asked about the Davy Crockett connection so many times that he had a real quick answer that he was third cousin by second marriage.
John Bowles was another UT student during the Jazz Age. Actually, he left at the end of the Jazz Age. He was in the men's chorus, and he also was a pitcher for the UT baseball team in 15, 16, and 17. The Glee Club in his last year featured Hawaiian music, but he was also known as the premier yodeler of Texas. He went over to France during the war. A lot of the students who helped create this jazz scene, this jazz way of life in Austin at UT, had been over to France for the war, and they hadn't necessarily seen much battlefield action. They had enjoyed their share of behind the front action with the French women, the wine women and song thing. So Bowles got into show business in the 1920s, was in the movies with Gloria Swanson, among other people. He made what is arguably the first cowboy movie. Well, let's see, Rio Rita and The Desert Song were two of those Western movies. In Rio Rita, he sang a song called The Ranger's Song, which established the earliest singing movie cowboys. He was one of the stars in Paul Whiteman's history-making film, The King of Jazz. And George Childs from Austin was another performer in that movie. George Childs was a dancer. He was a ballroom dancer, and he is totally forgotten now. But he and his partner in that movie, her body was like a rubber band.
It's a wild movie, and like each of those performances, is way out there.
Actually, one of the most interesting things is that his best-known role was that of Victor Moritz in the original Frankenstein in 1931. So, he could play singing cowboys. So, between Smith Ballou, who was a singing cowboy, and Tex Ritter, a singing cowboy, and then you have John Bowles, that's quite a collection of Western music talent that came out of UT in the 20s.
Well, to think about the future of country western music too, like how much the singing cowboy image played in that, and then Tex Ritter as an individual, he was so important in terms of the Nashville industry. He became a big sort of industry lobbyist in his later years in Nashville. And then thinking back to what you were saying about the Glee Club and the Hawaiian and yodeling music, those were such popular kind of vaudeville styles that came from outside of country music, eventually came inside, right? The steel guitar in country music comes from those Hawaiian players who were touring the South at the time. And the yodelers, like the country music historians debate this all the time, but one of the sources of yodeling is all of these Tyrolean Austrian troops that were traveling through those same vaudeville circuits. That people like Jimmy Rogers were picking it up in part from, those Austrians. So you have Hawaiian steel guitar, you have this Austrian yodeling, the singing cowboy, and Austin in the teens and the 20s seems to have been a magnet for a lot of that. Talk about like the rage for the hamburger, right? We think of the hamburger.
Yes.
And we think of like Martin's on the Drag as being this standalone historic venue, but you give some context for that, right?
Yes, and it's so appropriate now that Dirty's has opened again. It is literally the last of the old-time hamburger joints along the Drag. Is actually one of the younger ones. Hamburgers started out as county fair food, and I found out that as early as 1904, there was a contract for the hamburger concession handed out for one of the fairs in Austin at Camp Mabry. And the story goes into quite a bit of detail about the concessionaire who won the contract, who was not from Austin. He was from East Texas, but had gained quite a reputation for hamburgery, and I think his story may shake up the history of hamburgers as we have been told by people like Guy Fieri. Basically, as I say, as the 1919 school year began, UT students were eating ice cream sandwiches, which is important, and eating hamburgers and swimming and dancing at Deep Eddy Pool and Pavilion. And I have a great cartoon illustration in there, the 1927 issue of the Ranger. And somebody from the class of 26 is asking, "Did you ever hear about the fellow who bet he could eat 15 hamburgers?" And the class of 27 guy says, "No, what happened?" And the class of 26 guy says, "He won the bet, but he lost the hamburgers." That's how popular they were.
Yeah, so Dirty Martin's would have been like part of almost like a hamburger district there on Guadalupe, right? That the hamburger stands were all over the place.
Yes, it was called Hamburger Alley on Guadalupe Street. Poets made much of the scent of flowers, of rich perfumes, and the fragrant smell of new mown hay. Hamburger Alley had a seductive fragrance, peculiarly its own. The heavy, piercing odor of onions, raw and fried, old and new, an odor suggestive of tears and eats. Even a stranger could not miss it. All you had to do was walk from campus until you smelled the onions, then stop.
Well, now I'm getting hungry.
Well, I would hope so. It's time for a trip to Dirty's, right?
I want to go back to so Jimmy's Joy's recordings. I was looking this morning on Spotify. There's an album of recordings. It's got like 25 tracks.
Mm-hmm.
Were you saying that there weren't extant recordings, or was that just about those California recordings?
Well, until recently, I mean, if you say that there are some now, they cut a couple of hundred records. They brought them home and sold them at the co-op.
This morning I was listening to Bugle Call Rag, which has like they slip into the Eyes of Texas somewhere in the middle of it.
Well, that would not surprise me. They left to go on the Keith Orpheum circuit. They drove out to California to record in 24, and they recorded Bugle Call Rag, No No Nora, Sobbin' Blues, St. Louis Blues, Tiger Rag, and Wolverine Blues. So that's what they recorded. They came home. They sold them in front of the co-op. Smith Ballou had been in the band, and Maloney, his big deal was being able to play two clarinets at the same time, and he'd play harmony and melody on both clarinets. As soon as Jimmy Maloney showed that two clarinets could be played at once, a number of other bands and clarinetists said, well, shit, I can do that too. And then they went, I guess they were in Dallas, and they recorded the Meilenberg Joys, Clarinet Marmalade Blues, and Mama Will Be Gone for OK Records. Then in 28, they did From Monday On, Yale Blues, and I Got to Worry, and then You're the First Thing I Think of in the Morning. But that was sort of when they were sliding into less improvisational jazz, into orchestral. Well, and, you know, they dropped wild jazz, their traditional opener, in favor of Shine on Harvest Moon in 1927. You know Spud Murphy? He became a noted arranger, but he joined the band briefly. You know, Jimmy's Joys was popular. They moved up to Dallas, and then Alfonso Trent came to Dallas looking for work, and Jimmy's Joys didn't particularly like it, and neither did the Klan. And so Jimmy Maloney led a boycott against Alfonso Trent, which ultimately did not work. So
Alfonso Trent was a black band leader, a very influential black band leader, right? And took over that residency at the Adolphus. And Jimmy's Joys were one of the bands that were pushing back against that. And Alfonso Trent had a radio program from the Adolphus, right?
Yes, they did.
And so a lot of the guys who would later be like some of the cornerstones of the Kansas City sound, like all the bands that were forming up in Tulsa around this time, most of them point to Alfonso Trent's Adolphus broadcast as being really influential. And like, I think there's a chain that goes all the way to bebop that starts with those Adolphus Hotel broadcasts.
Yeah, there are. And I know the book goes into what little we know about the black jazz scene, which is very, very little. Of course, Gene Ramey came from here and went on to Kansas City, but there was a group called the Capital City Quartet here. They weren't jazzers, but the students loved them. Their leader was a guy named W.H. Stonewall Jackson. We know that he was probably a waiter at the Driscoll Hotel. And Cactus Pryor, I found in an interview with Cactus, who sang a mean baritone in his time. He often went to East Austin to hear the Capital City Quartet sing, and Jackson's awesome voice greatly impressed and influenced Cactus in his own singing career. There was a time in 1922, just in front of Mac's Hamburger stand there on Hamburger Row, that the Capital City Quartet was busking one day, singing old Southern darky tunes like Old Black Joe and Kentucky Blues. And it says here, the expressions on their faces as they sang ranged from doleful to sad and weeping to actually pained. Their listeners' expressions were anything but pained, and they expressed the hope that the quartet might favor them again soon with their music.
Well, it's one of the more fascinating things about this story, and I think there's going to be more room to look at it, is that it is a decade of cultural appropriation and appreciation with how central jazz and related musics are, blues as well. But it's also the decade in which Austin formally racially segregates. It always existed, but it's the 1928 master plan that, the city decides that they're only going to provide services to African-American residents if they live, east of East Avenue. So like the tension between those two things, that there is this political push to enshrine white supremacy and racial prejudice, while there's also this, that cultural draw and appreciation and that bridge, that those two things exist at the same time.
Well, that was because of the dichotomy between the city of Austin and the university, because the city of Austin was, as I said, very conservative. They enacted prohibition in 1918, which is, basically 2 years before it was adopted nationally. It was the first city in Texas to outlaw red light districts. So we have this idea now of Austin being this liberal communist bastion, but 100 years ago, we were one of the most conservative cities in Texas, but the university was not, because it was a public school, and the in loco parentis thing, the university said, "Hey, we're not gonna police your kids. If you're going to send your kids to school here, they're expected to be able to take care of themselves. We're not going to ride herd over them." You had, students basically doing what they wanted, whatever they wanted to do.
Well, maybe it's time for us to go find ourselves a burger. Thank you again, Richard and Eddie, for spending this time with us talking about Old Austin. We'll really enjoyed talking to Richard and Eddie today.
Well, I think we all enjoyed being here. I certainly did.
Appreciate it. Good deal.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Austin Roots, executive produced by TSSI, produced by Renee O'Connor. Crybaby, courtesy of Jake Andrews Music. You need to get the memoir so you can get ready for the pop quiz. Go to threadgills.com and get Armadillo World Headquarters a memoir. Do it now. Do it right.